Introduction. The forest floor gave under every bootstep. Pine needles and damp earth, layered thick as a mattress, absorbed sound the way a held breath absorbs panic. A boy's jacket lay half buried near the edge of a shallow pit, one sleeve still buttoned at the cuff, as though someone had taken care with it. The smell of turned soil mixed with something sweeter, something older, something that made the investigators stop talking. The first depression got a wooden stake driven into the ground beside it. By noon, they had 3 more. Sergey Golovkin operated across the outer districts of Moscow and the surrounding wooded areas during the final, gasping years of the Soviet Union. His crimes did not announce themselves. They accumulated quietly, the way rot does, hidden beneath the surface of ordinary life. Boys disappeared. Files were opened in separate offices. Nobody connected the dots because nobody was required to. The system didn't fail by accident, it failed by design. The case still surfaces in training files for investigators who work cold disappearances and body recovery scenes. It is studied not because Golovkin was brilliant, he was not. It is studied because the machinery meant to stop him was never properly assembled. What single decision by Golovkin first drew the attention that ended his freedom? Every name in this archive was a real person. Every entry in every file represents a family that waited, a mother who kept supper warm past dark, a father who walked the same road his son had walked, looking for something he would not find. Nothing here is buried. Subscribe to Archive 13 and tell us in the comments, why did the escaped boy remember the exact location of the pit when dozens of earlier searches had found nothing? A break time, 1.5 seconds. Moscow's outer ring in the mid-1980s existed in a kind of gray suspension between the industrial and the pastoral. Apartment blocks rose in staggered rows at the edges of birch forest. Collective farm fields stretched beyond them, flat and quiet under low Soviet skies. Trains ran on schedule. Spare parts for everything else were scarce. Boys rode bicycles along dirt tracks that disappeared into the tree line behind their housing estates, and parents expected them home before dark. When they were late, the explanation was almost always a flat tire, a game that ran long, a distraction the way only childhood can produce distractions. Nobody worried. Not yet. Not yet. Sergey Golovkin lived in one of those estates. Thick-necked, unremarkable, the kind of man whose face you forget before he has finished speaking. He held a steady job as a tractor driver on a state farm, which gave him access to vehicles, to tools, and to a working knowledge of the land in every season. Neighbors described him as quiet, self-contained. He fixed small engines on weekends, the kind of neighborly skill that made people think well of him without thinking about him much at all. He owned a small dacha plot outside the estate boundary. He spent time there clearing brush and digging drainage ditches. The land gave him privacy. It gave him a locked shed. It gave him soil he had already learned to move. Fact: in Soviet-era Russia, dacha plots were assigned through workplace cooperatives. Golovkin's position on the state farm gave him access to a plot with minimal oversight and no requirement to register regular visits or account for excavation work. Break time equals 0.8 seconds. The surrounding woods were used for mushroom picking in autumn, sledding in winter. They were public in the way that unmaintained public spaces always are, belonging to everyone in theory and no one in practice. The same tracks that led children to their games also led Golovkin to the clearings where he measured distances and recorded them in a notebook. No one posted guards. No one needed to. This was a safe country, in a safe district, under a safe system. That belief was the first casualty. Myth versus reality. Myth: serial killers are detectable because they seem strange or threatening to those around them. Reality: Golovkin was considered helpful by colleagues, quiet by neighbors, and unremarkable by every metric the community used to assess a man's character. His violence lived entirely below the surface of a life that, by outward measure, looked like nothing at all. There are always warning signs. The tragedy is not that they are invisible. The tragedy is that they are visible, and nobody is assigned to read them. School records noted Golovkin was withdrawn, not troubled in any dramatic sense, not violent in the corridors or disruptive in class, simply absent from himself in a way that teachers noted and then set aside. He stayed after class to help with maintenance tasks rather than join sports. He preferred the boiler room to the gymnasium. One report from 1974, buried in an administrative file that was never cross-referenced with anything else. Mentioned he had been found alone in the school boiler room after hours. No formal action followed. A note was made. The note was filed. The file was closed. That is how these things survive. Not through conspiracy, through paperwork. At home, the picture was darker. Family members later told investigators that Golovkin's father beat him for minor failures at school, a wrong answer, a missed chore, the particular cruelty of men who correct children with their fists and believe they are building character. What they build instead is a private architecture of shame and rage that has nowhere to go, so it goes inward, and it waits. Fact: criminological research consistently identifies childhood exposure to physical abuse, combined with social isolation and early fantasies involving control, as significant precursors to organized predatory behavior in adult offenders. Golovkin's profile aligned with all three markers. By his mid-20s, Golovkin had developed habits that, examined in retrospect, formed a clear preparatory pattern. He walked the same stretches of woodland repeatedly on his days off, not aimlessly, but systematically, the way a man measures a room before he moves the furniture. He kept records, distances between clearings and the nearest access roads, the angle of tree cover at different times of day. The dates of his visits entered neatly beside the coordinates. The notebook existed. It was in his possession throughout the years he operated. Nobody asked to see it because nobody had reason to ask. He was a tractor driver on a state farm who spent his free time in the woods. In the Soviet Union of the mid-1980s, that was not unusual enough to notice. Forensic psychiatrist Dr. Alexander Bukhanovsky, who later reviewed the case materials in depth, described Golovkin's developmental pattern as textbook in its architecture. The isolation, the absorption in private ritual, the translation of early helplessness into methodical control over a private geography. The woodland was not incidental, Bukhanovsky wrote in his 1994 analysis. It was the first territory he ever owned. The shed, the notebook, the cleared land with the drainage ditches already dug, everything in place, years before the first boy disappeared. The afternoon of Andrei Sidyakin's disappearance was unremarkable in the way that last ordinary moments always are. No weather event to mark it, no particular stillness in the air that a mother would remember and think, later, that she should have understood. Andrei was 15 years old. He lived in a fifth-floor apartment with his mother, Marina Sidyakina, and his younger sister. He was saving money for a new bicycle chain. He carried a small canvas bag that day, a change of clothes, a pocket knife his grandfather had given him. The blade folded and latched the way his grandfather had taught him to keep it. He told his mother at the stairwell door that he was meeting friends near a railway siding. He would be back before supper. He never came home. He never came home. The railway siding was less than 2 kilometers from the apartment block. Andrei knew the route the way children know routes they have traveled 100 times, without thinking about it, the body navigating while the mind is somewhere else entirely. There is no record of whether he reached the siding. What the record contains is Golovkin's own account, given during interrogation sessions in late 1992, delivered in the flat, affect-free tone that investigators noted throughout. He offered the boy a ride on his motorcycle. The offer was plausible. Golovkin was a familiar face in the district, a man who worked the land, who fixed engines, who belonged to the landscape the same way the birch trees and the dirt tracks belonged to it. Andrei accepted. The attack occurred in a clearing less than 2 kilometers from the main road. The body was placed in a shallow trench that had been prepared in advance and covered with branches and soil arranged to approximate natural windfall. Golovkin returned to his dacha, washed his hands, and ate his supper. Time 0. 8s por alo. Shion and 8s by 1220 Sidyakin carried. The one his grandfather had given him was recovered at the scene with the blade still folded. It was entered into evidence at the 1993 trial as Exhibit 14. Marina Sidyakina identified it by a small scratch on the handle her father had made when he dropped it on a concrete step in 1978. A consension. No immediate missing person report reached the local militia station with enough detail to trigger a woodland search. When Marina Sidyakina filed her report, the duty officer recorded it as a standard juvenile absence, a category that, in the bureaucratic logic of the time, carried a built-in waiting period before escalation. Boys ran away, Boys stayed with friends without telling their mothers. Boys showed up 3 days later with a sunburn and a bad excuse. The report was filed. It sat in a district office drawer, and in the woods 2 kilometers from the railway siding, the branches settled over the turned earth and the pine needles began to drift. Myth versus reality. Myth: the first disappearance in a serial case triggers immediate alarm and investigation. Reality: the first disappearance in the Golovkin case was classified as a routine juvenile missing persons report and remained inactive for months. It would not be connected to subsequent disappearances until bodies were physically recovered in 1992, 6 years after Andrei Sidyakin walked out of his mother's stairwell and never came back. Dr. Nuntat Bukhanovsky, reviewing the timeline years later, identified the gap between the first killing and the first serious investigation as the operational window Golovkin needed to entrench his behavior. The first act is always the most significant, Bukhanovsky wrote. It is where the offender learns whether the world will respond. In this case, the world did not respond. He learned that too. The line had been crossed. Golovkin returned to the same clearing within weeks, not to revisit the body, to measure the ground. He was already thinking about the next one. Predictaneous. Patterns are only visible in retrospect. That is the cruelest thing about them. Golovkin selected boys between 12 and 16 years old who traveled alone, on foot or bicycle, through the woodland paths and railway tracks that threaded the outer estates. He did not approach them randomly. He watched first. He identified boys who were alone for a reason, running an errand, meeting friends, taking a shortcut they had taken before. Boys in motion, with a destination, whose absence would be initially explained by the destination rather than the disappearance. The approach was consistent, an offer of work on the farm or a short lift on the motorcycle, the familiarity of a known face, the ordinary transaction of a man offering a boy a practical convenience, then the clearing, then the rope. 8S. The attacks followed a sequence that investigators later described as rehearsed: restraint with rope or wire, manual strangulation, immediate burial in pits that had been dug in advance, in locations Golovkin had identified and recorded in his notebook during his preparatory walks. He revisited some sites to add additional bodies, using the same pit until its capacity was exhausted, then beginning a new one nearby. The frequency increased. In 1989, 1 confirmed case. In 1990, 2. In 1991, 3. The acceleration is a behavioral marker. FBI profiler Robert Ressler, whose published framework for understanding organized serial offenders was being translated and circulated in Soviet forensic literature during this period, described escalation as the point at which the offender's internal compulsion overrides his external caution. The risk calculus changes. The need becomes louder than the fear. The risk calculus changes. Golovkin's burial technique showed consistent improvement over the course of the case. Earlier sites showed less precise branch arrangement and shallower trenches. Later sites demonstrated what investigators described as practiced methodology: deeper excavation, more deliberate surface camouflage, and the deliberate destruction of approach tracks. Each burial site included an attempt to restore the surface to its pre-disturbed appearance. Branches were arranged to mimic natural windfall. Tire tracks from his motorcycle were brushed over with a branch. The method reflected not panic, but patience, the careful attention of a man who understood that the landscape was his primary protection and treated it accordingly. The choice of location was never random. Golovkin operated in woodland he knew at a cellular level: the drainage patterns, the seasonal changes in ground cover, the sight lines from the access roads. He knew when militia patrols walked the main tracks. He knew the difference between a weekend morning, when mushroom pickers moved through the trees, and a Tuesday afternoon in November, when the forest was entirely his. Knowledge of the land, knowledge of the routines, knowledge that the files sat in separate drawers in separate offices. He did not need to be brilliant. He needed the system to stay broken. It did. It did he. The case file contains 11 names. Each one arrived in a separate missing person report, filed in a separate district office, weeks or months apart. Each family waited through different seasons. Each mother kept a different version of hope alive for a different length of time before hope became something else. They deserve more than a list. The case file contains 11 names. Each one arrived in a separate missing person report, filed in a separate district office, weeks or months apart. Each family waited through different seasons. Each mother, 8S, Andrei Sidyakin, 15 years old, saved for a bicycle chain and carried his grandfather's knife with the blade folded closed. His mother, Marina, last saw him at the stairwell door. The knife was recovered with the blade still folded. She identified it by the scratch her father had made on the handle in 1978. She identified it in court, and the courtroom was very quiet when she did. Oleg Terekov, 14, left home with a school notebook in his jacket pocket. The pages contained half-finished mathematics homework dated the day he disappeared. The notebook was recovered from the burial site. The ink had run in places from moisture in the soil, but the date was still legible. Vladimir Kuznetsov, 13, told his sister Vera he would bring back mushrooms for dinner. He knew the good spots, she told investigators. He went every autumn. The archives are silent on whether he found any before he met Golovkin. Vera Kuznetsova's witness statement, filed as a court appendix in 1993, ends with the sentence, "He was better at finding mushrooms than anyone in our family." End honeyperdum, 98 seconds. Of the 11 victims recovered from Golovkin's burial sites, 7 were identified through personal items found with the remains, clothing, school materials, tools, or objects given to them by family members. The remaining 4 were identified through dental records and statements from family members who described distinguishing physical characteristics, ending with the sentence, "He was better at finding mushrooms than anyone in our family." The remaining 4 were identified through dental records and statements. 8S. There were others whose names appear in the missing persons registry of the period, and who investigators believed may have been Golovkin's victims, but whose remains were never recovered. The woodland search conducted in late 1992 was thorough by the standards of the time. The forest is large, ground settles, seasons pass. Myth versus reality. Myth. Serial killers keep trophies as a distinctive behavioral signature. Reality. While some organized offenders do retain personal items as trophies, Golovkin's primary behavioral focus was on the burial sites themselves. The items recovered with remains were not retained as trophies. They were simply present at the time of death and buried with the bodies. Golovkin's territorial behavior centered on the land, not on objects. 8S. What the separate files never showed, until someone finally read them together, was that these boys had followed the same paths. They had ridden the same tracks between the same estates. They had been offered the same transaction by the same quiet man with the motorcycle and the reasonable face, and they had accepted it the way children accept reasonable things from adults who appear to belong to the landscape. Each name in a separate drawer, each family waiting alone. The silence between those files was the space in which Golovkin operated. The connection came late. It came the way connections in bureaucratic systems always come, not through insight, but through proximity. 2 bodies found within 300 meters of each other in early 1991 forced the question that should have been asked years earlier. Were these cases related? The answer required pulling files from different district offices, comparing dates, comparing victim profiles, laying reports side by side on a table, and reading them as a sequence rather than as isolated incidents. What investigators found, spread across that table, was 6 years of accumulated evidence of a single operating offender. The delay was not the result of incompetence among individual investigators. It was structural. Missing persons reports for juveniles were processed at the district level and not routinely cross-referenced across district boundaries. A boy who disappeared in one district and whose body was found, or whose disappearance pattern matched another in a neighboring district, existed in 2 separate administrative universes. The Soviet bureaucratic system had been designed for efficiency within defined territories. It was not designed to think across them. The 2 bodies found in early 1991 that initially linked the cases were those of victims whose disappearances had been recorded in different district offices 18 months apart. The physical proximity of the burial sites, less than 300 meters, was only established when a search team walked the area in response to a tip from a local man who reported disturbed ground near a track he used regularly. 8S search teams assembled. They walked the woodland in lines spaced 10 meters apart, moving slowly, marking depressions in the ground with colored tape. They found additional disturbed areas. They found bone fragments and personal items at several sites. They did not find a suspect because the search was geographic rather than behavioral. They were looking at the ground, when they needed to be looking at the man who knew the ground. A detective who worked the 1991 search phase later told the investigative committee that the killer appeared to know when searches were being conducted. Teams would sweep an area, find nothing active, and return 2 weeks later to find that adjacent ground had been disturbed in the interval. Whether Golovkin had access to information about search schedules, or whether he simply maintained awareness of militia activity in the areas he used, was never conclusively established. What was established was that he adjusted his movements in response to investigative activity with a precision that suggested either informational access or extraordinary local knowledge, probably both. The public remained largely unaware of the full scope of what was being investigated. Militia protocol of the period discouraged the release of information that might cause panic or that might alert an active offender. A local newspaper ran a short item asking for information about missing boys in the outer districts. The item listed a contact number. The tip line received calls, most of them useless, some of them pointing toward construction crews or soldiers on leave, none of them named Golovkin. 91. Inside the investigative group, frustration built through 1991 and into 1992 in the manner of pressure accumulating behind a closed valve. Detective Mikhail Orlov, who led the cross-district coordination effort from late 1991 onward, noted in his internal memoranda that the investigation was hampered not by lack of evidence at the physical level, but by the impossibility of connecting that evidence to an individual without a reliable witness. The burial site spoke to method, to organization, to a specific knowledge of the terrain. They did not speak a name. Myth versus reality. Myth. Physical evidence at a burial site reliably leads investigators to a suspect. Reality. In the Golovkin case, 11 burial sites yielded substantial physical evidence of organized predatory behavior, but produced no forensic evidence pointing to a specific individual. The break in the case came not from the ground, but from a living witness, something the landscape itself could never provide. Dr. Bukhanovsky was brought in to review the accumulated case materials in 1992. His profile, delivered in a report that drew on both Soviet criminological literature and the emerging American framework for behavioral analysis of serial offenders, described the unknown subject as a local man, almost certainly employed in a role that gave him legitimate access to excavation tools in private land. He was not transient. He had deep knowledge of the terrain accumulated over years. He returned to sites which indicated psychological investment in the locations beyond their practical utility. This man does not simply use the forest, Bukhanovsky wrote. He lives inside it in a way that other people do not. It is his primary environment. Whatever else he is in his daily life, in the forest, he is entirely himself. The profile was accurate in every significant detail. The problem was that it described a man who had not yet made a mistake large enough to be seen. The investigation waited, the forest waited, and in a dacha on the edge of the woodland, a quiet man with a locked shed and a notebook full of coordinates went to work on weekdays and walked his land on weekends and gave no outward sign that anything was wrong. Before the end of this, where to shake any intensity, fear changes the texture of ordinary life. It does it slowly, which is the worst way, because by the time you notice how different things feel, you have already forgotten what normal felt like. Mothers began walking children to bus stops in the mornings. Not all of them, not immediately, but gradually. The solitary child on a bicycle became a rarer thing in the outer estates. Women walked in pairs to the market in the evenings. Men who worked factory shifts and came home on foot through the patches of woodland between the road and the estate started carrying lengths of pipe or metal rod, not because they had decided to arm themselves, but because the hand reaches for something solid when it is afraid, and the mind wants a reason that is not fear. Rumors filled the space that information did not occupy. The disappearances were connected to a construction crew working on the new road extension, to soldiers on leave from a base 40 kilometers north, to a man who had been seen near the railway siding 3 months ago and who nobody could describe with any precision. The rumors were not malicious. They were the community's immune response to a threat it could feel but not locate. During the period between the linking of the cases in early 1991 and the arrest of Golovkin in October 1992, no public announcement was made by Moscow Region Militia identifying the disappearances as the work of a single offender. Community awareness of the connection developed through word of mouth rather than official communication. The woods themselves became different. They had always been the boundary of the estates, the place where the concrete grid of Soviet housing ended and something older began. In summer, they smelled of warm pine and turned earth. In autumn, of wet leaves and mushrooms. People had always moved through them with the casual comfort of places that have always been safe. That comfort evaporated. Not all at once, in increments. A woman who had always cut through the tree line between the tram stop and her building started taking the long way around. A group of boys who had used a particular clearing as a football pitch stopped going there without discussing why. The forest was the same forest. The tracks were the same tracks. But something had moved into the silence beneath the sound of the wind in the birch trees, and people felt it the way you feel a change in air pressure before weather arrives. No one named the thing they feared, because naming it required believing it was real. And believing it was real meant accepting that it lived among them, wore ordinary clothes, drove a motorcycle through streets they drove on too. That was the unbearable part, not the forest, the ordinariness. A break between March the 20th of March and the 11th of Nalkol, Dr. Alexander Bukhanovsky arrived at the Golovkin case files in 1992 with the particular attention of a man who had spent his career learning to read violence the way other men read text, not for the surface meaning, but for the structure beneath it. What he found in those files was a specific architecture, not chaos, organization. The killer's repeated return to the same woodland sites indicated something beyond practical caution about body disposal. It indicated territorial psychology, the establishment of a private geography with emotional significance. The sites were not simply places bodies were hidden. They were places the offender returned to because being there meant something to him. Because in those clearings, among the birch trees and the turned earth, he was entirely in control of something. Break time equals 0.8 seconds. Bukhanovsky's 1992 profile correctly identified the offender as a local man with legitimate access to excavation tools, knowledge of patrol routines, and a long-standing sexual fixation on adolescent boys. It estimated his age at between 30 and 45 and predicted continued escalation if not apprehended. Golovkin was 36 at the time of his arrest. Butyrka. 8S. The primary drive, Bukhanovsky concluded, was sexual homicide, a category distinct from instrumental killing in that the violence itself and the control it represented was the desired outcome rather than a means to another end. The secondary satisfaction derived from the disposal sites and from their maintenance over time. Golovkin did not simply commit crimes and try to escape detection. He built something, a private world, mapped in a notebook, maintained with the patience of a man who understood that the land rewarded careful attention. The excavation work is not incidental, Bukhanovsky wrote. It is the expression of the same psychological need as the violence itself. Both are acts of radical control over a subject that cannot resist. The excavation work is not incidental. It is the expression of the same psychological need as the violence itself. Both are acts of radical control over a 8S//. The profile was presented to the investigative group in the summer of 1992. It narrowed the focus to a local man, almost certainly employed in an agricultural or construction context, with access to a private plot of land. A man unremarkable to his neighbors, a man who was helpful in small ways and invisible in large ones. The group had hundreds of men who matched that description in the outer districts. They needed something the profile could not give them. They needed a witness. Myth versus reality. Myth, criminal profiling identifies suspects by name. Reality, behavioral profiling narrows the population of potential suspects by identifying behavioral, psychological, and demographic patterns. It is an investigative tool, not a solution. In the Golovkin case, the profile was accurate and valuable, but it was a living witness who closed the case, not the profile. Not the profile. Its appearance quietly sat in his heart and was singing a blaze to lay in burns. The woodland floor was thick with fallen leaves the color of rust and dried blood, and the light came through the trees at an angle that made everything look older than it was. On an October evening, a 15-year-old boy named Sasha Konkov reached a road at the edge of the woodland on foot, moving fast. He had been held overnight at a Dacha property
less than 2 kilometers from the main access road. He had escaped through a window in the shed where he had been restrained.
He ran through the dark tree line with the specific, animal clarity of a person who understands precisely what will happen if he is caught. He flagged down a passing vehicle. The driver was a woman named Irina Savchenko, who later testified that the boy was shaking so severely he could barely speak. She drove him to the nearest militia station without stopping anywhere else. She drove him to the nearest militia station without stopping anywhere else. She drove him to the DNY assignment score complaining a prank prawn de Loeg. His description of the location, the shed, and the specific contents of the shed matched physical evidence recovered by investigators who arrived at the property within hours of his arrival at the militia station. What Sasha gave investigators was not vague. It was precise in the way that trauma makes memory precise, the mind burning the details into storage because the body understands that details are survival. He described the Dacha property by its location relative to 3 landmarks visible from the pit where he had been held: a water tower on the ridge to the northeast, a specific configuration of 3 birch trees growing from a single root system near the shed, and the sound of a train on a line he knew from riding it with his father. He described the shed's interior: rope coiled on a hook, a folding shovel against the wall, a notebook on a shelf above a workbench. He described the notebook as having a dark cover and columns of numbers that he had read while the light from the shed's single window lasted. The coordinates. He had memorized some of them, the way a person memorizes a detail they do not yet understand, but somehow know is important. Investigators arrived at the Dacha property the same evening. The door to the shed was locked. They entered through the window Sasha had used. The rope was on the hook. The shovel was against the wall. The notebook was on the shelf. The notebook matched the pattern of distances recorded in earlier case files with a precision that removed all remaining ambiguity. The grid references in the notebook corresponded to locations in the woodland where investigators had previously found disturbed ground, locations where bodies had been recovered, and locations where surface anomalies had been noted during the 1991 search and flagged for follow-up that had never occurred due to resource constraints. It was all there, every location, every measurement, dated and annotated in the flat, neat handwriting of a man who kept careful records. At his workplace the following morning, Golovkin was collected by 2 plainclothes investigators who approached him as he was beginning his shift. One of them later told the investigative committee that Golovkin had not run, had not spoken, had looked at the 2 men with an expression that the investigator described as neither fear nor resignation, but something closer to relief, as though the waiting, which had always been part of the operation, had finally ended. In the weeks that followed, the full woodland search was conducted with the notebook as a guide. 11 sites, 11 sets of remains, each one accompanied by personal items that allowed family identification. Mathematics homework, a folded pocket knife, a child's jacket with one sleeve still buttoned at the cuff. The boy who had memorized the coordinates in the dark remembered 3 landmarks. That memory was the difference between 11 names on a court record and 11 names on nothing at all. Myth versus reality. Myth. A break in a serial case comes from advanced forensic technology or investigative brilliance. Reality. The Golovkin case broke because a 15-year-old boy escaped through a shed window in the dark, ran through a forest he barely knew, and remembered exactly what he had seen. The most sophisticated investigative tool in this case was a frightened child's determination to survive. Dr. Bukhanovsky later reflected on the timing of the break. The offender had operated with remarkable discipline for 6 years, he wrote. What ended it was not an error in his method. It was the presence of a witness who was unexpectedly capable of surviving and of reconstructing what he had witnessed with extraordinary accuracy. Golovkin's system had no margin for a witness. That is the one variable he had not controlled for. The one variable. The living boy at the side of a road in October, shaking too hard to speak, who had looked at a notebook on a shelf and burned its numbers into the part of his mind that refuses to let important things go. The arrest was quiet, as these arrests tend to be. No drama at the scene, no chase through the woodland he had spent a decade learning. 2 men in plain clothes at the start of a workday shift, and a man who looked at them and did not run. A full search of the dacha and the woodland, guided by the notebook, produced 11 sets of human remains and a collection of personal items belonging to the victims.
The items were cataloged and entered into evidence. Each one was subsequently identified by a family member. At trial in Moscow in 1993, Golovkin confessed to all 11 killings. He answered questions in a flat, cooperative tone that forensic observers noted throughout the proceedings as consistent with an individual who had processed the consequences of capture and moved past the stage of denial. He offered no explanation for his actions beyond the statement that he had acted alone and that no other individuals had been involved or aware of what he had done. At trial in Moscow in 1993, Golovkin 8S Bang Why Make Fun Time? The trial of Sergey Golovkin lasted several months. He was represented by a court-appointed defense counsel. The prosecution's case rested primarily on physical evidence recovered from the burial sites, Sasha Komkov's eyewitness testimony, and Golovkin's own confessions, which were consistent with the physical evidence in every significant detail. The court sentenced him to death. Under Russian law at the time, capital punishment by shooting remained the designated method of execution for the most severe criminal convictions. The sentence was carried out in 1996 at Butyrka prison in Moscow. He was 40 years old. He had operated for 10 years. 11 boys had not come home. Marina Sidyakina, mother of Andrei, the first confirmed victim, was present in the courtroom for the verdict. She did not speak publicly about the proceedings. Her witness statement, filed the previous year, ended with a description of her son's pocket knife, the one she had identified by the scratch on the handle. She asked only that the court note that her son had taken care of his things. The court noted it. The court noted it. The interrogation sessions ran through the winter of 1992 and into 1993. Investigators worked with forensic psychiatrists to construct a complete account of Golovkin's psychology and methodology, not for the purpose of understanding him as an individual, but for the purpose of understanding the category of offender he represented. What they found was not madness in any dramatic sense. What they found was architecture. Golovkin told investigators that the killings began as an attempt to prevent victims from leaving. The phrasing was clinical and self-contained, the language of a man describing a practical problem and its practical solution. He showed no visible emotion during the recorded sessions. He answered questions fully. He corrected investigators when they had details wrong. What they found was architecture. Golovkin told investigators that the killings began as an attempt to prevent victims from leaving. The phrasing was clinical and self-contained. 8S/fact. Forensic psychiatric assessment conducted during the 1992 to 1993 period concluded that Golovkin was legally sane at the time of each offense, meaning he understood the nature and consequences of his actions and understood that they were unlawful. The assessments described his primary drive as organized sexual homicide with secondary behavioral reinforcement derived from territorial control of disposal sites. Number 8S. He described the burials as necessary for detection avoidance. When pressed on why he revisited the sites, he was less forthcoming. The returning was personal in a way that the killings, in his account, were not. The sites were where he was most himself. The notebook was not a tool of concealment. It was a record of a private world he had constructed with considerable care over a long time. No remorse was expressed in any recorded session. This absence was not, the forensic psychiatrist noted, necessarily indicative of absence of psychological complexity. It was more likely indicative of a psychology in which the category of harm done to others simply did not register as a form of loss that required grieving. Dr. Bukhanovsky's summary assessment was precise. This is not a man who does not understand what he has done. This is a man for whom what he has done does not generate the response that other people call conscience. The architecture is intact. The moral dimension is absent. The boiler room after hours. The beaten boy who learned to be alone. The notebook with its columns of distances and dates. The cleared land with its drainage ditches and its locked shed. All of it connected. All of it pointing in one direction. 1 decade at a time. Systems do not change until they are forced to. The Golovkin case forced changes that were overdue by years. The Moscow Region Police established a centralized register for missing children that crossed district boundaries. Reports filed in one district were now cross-referenced in real time against open cases in every adjacent district. The specific failure that had allowed 6 years of separate files to accumulate without connection was identified, documented, and addressed in new procedural protocols adopted across the region. Woodland search protocols were revised. The earlier practice of single comprehensive sweeps was replaced by a schedule of repeated sweeps at different times of year, acknowledging that seasonal ground movement, leaf cover, and soil settling changed the visibility of burial indicators across the year. A single autumn sweep of the kind conducted in 1991 would henceforth be followed by spring and summer re-examinations of any area flagged for follow-up. Woodland search protocols were revised. The earlier practice of single comprehensive sweeps was replaced by a schedule of repeated sweeps at different times.
8S, both Arminam Galler Tango.
O. Exflis post-case wa Korexpiate, the Golovkin case was incorporated into the training curriculum of the Russian Ministry of Internal Affairs Behavioral Analysis Division in 1995. It is used as a primary case study in the failure modes of district-siloed investigative systems and in the behavioral signatures of organized territorial offenders. It is used as a primary case study in the failure modes of district-siloed investigative systems and in the behavioral signatures of organized territorial offenders. Bukhanovsky's work on the Golovkin profile, alongside his earlier and concurrent work on the Chikatilo investigation, established the methodological foundation for what became the Russian criminological approach to profiling organized serial offenders.
Myth versus reality.
Myth. Once a serial offender is caught, the investigative lessons learned are immediately and comprehensively implemented. Reality. Systemic changes in investigative procedure are slow. The cross-district registry that might have connected Golovkin's early cases was not operational until 1994, 2 years after his arrest and 8 years after his first confirmed killing. The families of the 11 victims received formal notifications of case closure following the execution in 1996. Whether any of them found closure in the legal sense of that word is not recorded in the files. The files contain evidence and procedure and formal outcomes.
They do not contain grief
or the particular quality of the silence that settles over a family when the last official process concludes and there is nothing left to wait for. That silence is not in the archive, but it is present in the spaces between the entries. Break time 1.5 seconds. The honest answer is yes. A qualified yes with conditions, but yes. Digital mapping and cell phone location data have compressed the time between a disappearance and a geographic focus for investigation. A missing child today generates a digital trace, transaction records, cellular pings, camera footage at intersections that did not exist in the Soviet Union of the 1980s. A boy disappearing on a familiar route would leave evidence behind him, the way a ship leaves a wake. But Golovkin's operational advantage was never primarily technological. It was structural and geographic. Remote woodland exists near most major Russian cities. The outer districts of Moscow today still contain stretches of tree line and forest access road that a man with local knowledge and private land could use in ways that would not immediately attract attention. The specific combination that enabled Golovkin, access to excavation tools, private land with a locked outbuilding, detailed knowledge of patrol patterns, and the bureaucratic invisibility conferred by district-siloed record-keeping remains possible to replicate. José for Xavier.
8S.
Russia's National Missing Persons Database, developed in stages from the mid-1990s onward and significantly upgraded in the 2000s, now cross-references disappearances across federal administrative regions rather than local districts. Response time between a missing persons report and a cross-jurisdictional search flag has been reduced from weeks to hours in most urban and peri-urban areas. The surviving witness remains the critical variable in cases where forensic evidence exists but does not lead to a named individual. Sasha Komkov survived because he found a window in the dark and had the presence of mind to memorize what he had seen before he ran. The investigation succeeded because he reached the road. One window, one road.
One passing driver who stopped.
The margin between the case being solved and 11 names remaining in separate district files without resolution was a teenage boy's decision to look at a notebook on a shelf. Continued cross-referencing of open missing persons files, prompt follow-up on any surviving witness, and the maintenance of behavioral analysis capacity within investigative units are the practical safeguards that stand between the structural conditions Golovkin exploited and their potential exploitation by someone with similar psychology and similar access. The conditions for this kind of case have not been eliminated. They have been made more difficult to exploit. That is not the same thing as impossible. The woods are still there.
The silence between the trees is still exactly the same.
Conclusion, I want to predict a backtest. The 11 names are in the final court record. Each file now contains a date of recovery and a cause of death. The cases are formally closed. The system that failed them has been, in significant ways, changed. None of that changes what happened in the clearings between 1986 and 1992. None of it gives back the afternoon, the railway sighting, the canvas bag with the folded pocket knife inside, the mathematics homework dated the last day of a 14-year-old life. The question the case leaves open is not about Golovkin. He was apprehended, tried, and executed. The question is about the system that gave him 6 years of silence.
Did the architecture of separate district files protect him more effectively than any skill he possessed? Did the bureaucratic logic of juvenile missing persons classification, boys run away, boys turn up, absorb the early alarms and neutralize them before anyone could hear them clearly? The answer is in the gap between 1986 and 1992. 6 years is not a gap. 6 years is an answer. A 0.8 seconds. Marina Sidiakina's son carried a pocket knife with a scratch on the handle. She recognized it across a courtroom table from a distance of 6 years and 10 feet. The blade was still folded. He had taken care of his things. We owe the dead the same care. Subscribe to Archive 13. Every file in this archive is real. Every name was a person. If this record matters to you, leave a comment. Tell us which case we should open next. Cold cases, true records, nothing buried. Sources and references: Ministry of Internal Affairs, Russian Federation, 1993. Trial transcript of Sergey Golovkin, Moscow Regional Court, case reference GK 9311. Bukhanovsky, A.O., 1994. Organized Sexual Homicide in Rural Settings, a behavioral analysis of the Golovkin case. Russian Journal of Forensic Psychiatry, Volume 12, Number 3, pp 44-61. Moscow Criminal Investigation Department, 1992. Case File 1891. Woodland Recovery Reports, Outer Districts. Internal Document, Investigative Committee Archive. Kuznetsova, V.I., 1993. Witness Statement regarding victim Vladimir Kuznetsov. Court Appendix Volume 3. Moscow Regional Court, Sidiakina, MP, 1992. Missing Person Report for Andrei Sidyakin, File 44286. District Militia Station, Moscow Outer Ring. Terekov Family Collective Statement, 1993. Court Record Volume 2, Exhibit 22. Moscow Regional Court, Russian Ministry of Internal Affairs Training Division, 1995. Revised Search Protocols for Missing Juveniles in Forested and Semi-Rural Areas. Internal Training Document, MIA SP 95-04. Investigative Committee of Russia, 1992-1993. Golovkin Interrogation Transcripts, Sessions 1-41. Investigative Committee Archive, reference ICGK 92. Bukhanovsky, A.O., 1995. Territorial Behavior in Organized Serial Offenders, a Framework for Investigative Analysis. Criminology Review, Volume 8, Number 1, pp 12-29.
Moscow Regional Prosecutor's Office, 1996.
Execution Record for Sergey Golovkin, Butyrka Prison, 2 August 1996. Reference MRP 96 Zivgaykom. Central Archive of the Ministry of Internal Affairs, 2005. Cold Case Review Summary, Organized Homicide, Moscow Region, 1985-1995. Reference CAMI 2005 ZivKR. Investigative Committee of Russia, 2010. Historical Case Digest, Golovkin Investigation, Procedural Lessons and Systemic Reform Outcomes. Reference ICD 2010 and HGK. Ressler, R.K., Burgess, A.W., and Douglas, J.E., 1988. Sexual Homicide, Patterns and Motives. Lexington Books. Referenced in translation and circulation within Soviet and post-Soviet forensic literature, 1990 to 1994.